Welcome and good morning for those of you here in the morning time. Good afternoon and good evening to the rest of you. We are about to begin our Student Climate Research Campaign webinar today. First, I'd like to go over some technical notes. Please type your questions in the chat window. You can type them in at any time, although we will have a formal question and answer period after the webinar is over, but we'll be sure to go back and answer any questions that you entered throughout the webinar. Please remember to make sure the speaker icon above is enabled. It should be green. And check your volume levels by selecting Adjust Speaker Volume. Audio and video has only been enabled for presenters during this webinar, so don't worry, we cannot hear or see you. If you have any trouble connecting or lose a connection and need assistance during the webinar, please email climatecampaign@globe.gov. Greetings. Today's webinar is entitled Scientist Skills, Presenting Your Results. My name is Sarah Tessendorf. I'm part of the Globe Program Office Science and Education team, and I will be walking you through some of my experiences as a scientist presenting my results that I've presented at conferences and in reports, and to go over some of the tips that I've learned. So we're going to be talking about, first of all, why do we need to present our scientific research results? And then we'll talk a little bit about the types of presentations and some tips on both creating the presentation and giving the presentation, as well as some common challenges that you might face and my suggestions for how to overcome those challenges. And then we'll have a summary, and we'll end with some upcoming dates and information related to the Student Climate Research Campaign. So why is it so important to present our research results? Well, first of all, this is the primary way that we share our results with our communities. It can inform society about important and relevant scientific developments that may impact their lives. If you share with the scientific community, this can help lead to scientific collaborations. Other scientists that might be doing similar research to you might want to work with you on your projects in the future. And also, when we share our results with the community, it leaves a record of that research. And so as we do future research, we can build upon others' research and not repeat what's been done in the past. And another important reason is so that you receive credit for doing the research. If you don't present your results by writing a paper or giving a presentation, how will anyone know what you did? So there are a variety of types of presentation. First of all, the probably most common format is written reports or publications. That's one key way that we can convey our scientific research with others. But we also have scientific conferences or science fairs where we can present research in a variety of ways, including oral presentations, which I sometimes will call a talk. Here below you can see a photo of two students giving a talk on their science project. And there's also poster presentations. And you can see here a photo of another student giving a poster presentation at a scientific conference poster session. The majority of this webinar will focus on oral presentation tips, but I will talk a little bit about some tips on creating poster presentations as well. One other presentation type that's a little bit more unique, especially for Globe and the virtual student conference, is a video. The virtual student conference requires a video because these presentations are going to be looked at by community members and other students all over the world at any given time throughout the month of May. And so in addition to having your report, having a video is a nice medium for people to view what you've done with your project. And for the conference, we require that the videos are less than 12 minutes long, but there are many options for what this video can contain. It could be just a narrated PowerPoint presentation, which would be very similar to if you were giving a live presentation with PowerPoint, or even a recording of a poster or oral presentation being presented. But please be creative as well. In the past, we've had some students create songs about their research projects or do interviews or demonstrations. You could include video footage about the scientific problem being addressed, or any combination of the above. Please don't limit your creativity. Just use this as a nice medium for community members who are viewing your project online to learn a little bit more about your project in a very creative and interactive way. So some tips for creating your presentations. For most presentations, you're going to need to consider 3 considerations: time, audience, and message. And for each of these 3 considerations, I'll go into a bit more detail on upcoming slides. A few other general tips that I'll mention is it's important to start early and ask your colleagues and peers to provide feedback. And also, it's good to include a list of acknowledgments to thank those people who have helped in the project, those people who have provided the data for your project, or at least the sources where you got your data from, people that provided feedback on your research project that helped you revise it and make it better, people who mentored you. All of those people should be acknowledged in both an oral or poster presentation as well as in your research reports. So let's talk a little bit about time. It's really important to pay attention to your time. Especially, this is most pertinent to oral presentations because you're usually limited to a certain amount of time. For most scientific conferences that I attend, we're given about 12 to 15 minutes. And so it's really important to stick within that time, that you keep your points concise and limit your new ideas to 1 new idea per slide if possible, so that you can help your audience understand your presentation better. One other rule that I use is a 1 slide per minute rule. And so if I have 12 minutes to give a presentation, I try to make sure that my presentation is not more than 12 slides. And the reason for doing this is because your audience cannot absorb your message when you go too fast and cover too much in a short amount of time. Now, poster presentations are a little bit different. They're less limited by time, but they are limited by space. You usually only have a set amount of space to put all of your information in. And so you still need to keep your points very concise and try to avoid using too much text, and instead use more graphics and visual aids so that it's much more visually appealing and that those key points stand out much better. If they're embedded in lots and lots of text, it's going to be hard for somebody reading and looking at your poster to really understand what those key points are. So now another key consideration is your audience. Now you need to consider your audience for both oral and poster presentations. In order to do this, it's really important to start your presentation by expressing the motivation and importance of your presentation, of your research. Why should your audience care about what you're going to talk to them about and present to them? Why is it important in their lives? Why should they listen and learn about what you've done? So that motivation is really important to really catch the audience, help them understand why what you've done is important to them. It's also important to define all specialized terms and acronyms, and definitely avoid jargon. If you use too many terms and acronyms that your audience doesn't know, they're not going to be able to understand your presentation. And as an example from my past, when I was an undergraduate student and I started attending scientific conferences, I went to a lot of talks that were over my head. I did not understand anything in the talk. I left the talk thinking that I was stupid, that I didn't understand it, probably because I was a young student. But there was also another reason. Sure, as a young student, I didn't know all the science topics yet, but the presenters that I saw speaking also probably didn't do a very good job of defining all the terms and acronyms that they needed to do to speak to an audience that included students. So they were speaking to too specialized of an audience. And so it's really important that if you want to make sure you communicate effectively with your whole entire audience, that you consider defining all these terms so that anybody in your audience can understand. One other tip is if your talk is too long or very long and covers a lot, say you're giving an hour-long seminar, it's really important to include an outline at the beginning of the presentation so that your audience knows all the things that you're going to talk about, so that they can plan ahead and know what's coming and help understand. It will help them understand what all you're going to talk about. The last key consideration is your message. It's really important to have a very clear and focused message. In conveying this message, it's really good to use a lot of graphics to avoid just text on a slide when possible, but make sure that those graphics are large enough to be legible. Also, avoid equations. In science, we do use a lot of equations, and sometimes it's hard to avoid using 1 or 2 equations. If you must use an equation in your presentation, be sure to define all the terms and how to interpret it, just as you would for any other specialized term or acronym. But it's best to avoid too many equations because that can easily lose your audience. Equations are great in a written report when somebody can have time to work through it and think about it, but in a short presentation where they only see the equation for a minute or less, it's really too short of time for them to understand. And always include a summary slide to list the key points that you want your audience to remember, those key points that you've been talking about throughout your presentation and giving some support for. You want to summarize what those are at the very end. Now, one really important point here is that 1 to 3 key points is usually all that the audience will remember after your talk. So try not to summarize 5, 10 points. Really bring it down to the most important 1 to 3 key points. So now this is an example of not a good slide to use. But I will be very honest, as I started to create this presentation, this was the slide that I started creating about some of those tips for creating the presentation that we just went over. I listed those key considerations, and then I started listing details for each one. So as you look at the slide, you can see, one, that there's way too much text, it's too small of font, and it's very boring to look at. But moreover, there's also more than one new idea being expressed on this slide. And so as I went through and created and revised my presentation, I realized that's too many points to have on one slide. I'm going to break it up and separate those out into separate slides, like the ones that we just went through. So now moving on to presentation tips for giving your presentation. First of all, I'd like to point out the very professionally dressed young lady on the left here. One of the key things I'd like to mention is that it's really important to dress professionally when you give a presentation. It expresses to your audience that you take very seriously what you're going to present. It's very important to you, even before you've opened your mouth and started to speak. So it's a very important part of giving a presentation is to look very presentable and respectful and professional. Also, it's important to practice beforehand. Practicing helps you know how long you're going to be talking for, and if you're going over your time limit, then you can go back and shorten your talk in places. So that helps ensure that you're within the time limits that you've been given. It also helps you keep your message on each slide focused. There have been many times when I've practiced talks where I'll start telling a story that I think is related, but then I go on, and it just really side rails into something else that I don't really want to talk about. And so the next time I practice it, I remember, don't tell that story, and it'll help keep my message more focused and on time. Also, slow down. We often speak way faster than we realize. So as you go through your presentation, and you're giving your presentation, take many reminders to slow down, take deep breaths and short pauses. Short pauses are actually okay, and they're much better than filling in gaps with or some other sound that can actually be more distracting than helpful. And also explain all aspects of a graphic thoroughly. In previous slides, I mentioned the importance of including lots of graphics, making sure they're large enough to be legible. But in addition to that, you really have to explain what that graphic shows. Explain what the axes are, the labels, the symbols, and explain to your audience how they should interpret it. What does that graph say? Don't assume that the audience will be able to interpret it at a quick glance, because it's probably their first time that they've seen that graphic. You've seen it a number of times as you've been developing your research project, but they've only seen it once. So you really need to help the audience by explaining every aspect of your graphics and how they should interpret it. So there are a number of common challenges that I'll go over. The first one relates to that key consideration on time. Time limits are a very common challenge, especially for giving oral presentations. As I mentioned, scientific conferences often limit your talks in time. They have to do that because they have to fit in a lot of talks in a given time period. So they often limit talks, say, to 12 to 15 minutes, and that seems really short. And so it's really important, in order to stay to that time, that you practice your talk, make sure you don't go over, and if you do go over in your practice, that you shorten your talk, and follow that 1 slide per minute rule. That's also a helpful tip for sticking to your time limit. What happens when you have a very broad audience or an unknown audience? I mentioned before you should consider your audience, but what if you don't know who your audience is? My suggestion for this is to always plan to speak to a very general audience just as a precaution. Just make sure as standard practice that you define all of your specialized scientific terms. And in your mind, think about if you were to present this research to your grandparents or maybe to your little brother or sister, somebody who you don't think would have a really detailed scientific knowledge like you've developed from doing the project, and make sure that you could speak to them and they would understand. And that would help ensure that every person in your audience, whether they're a very expert scientist or they're a younger student, will all be able to take away that important information that you're conveying in your presentation. So given time limits, and given the fact that we need to have a really focused message of maybe 1 to 3 key points, choosing just those few points is also a challenge. Because you've been doing this research project maybe all year long, so you've been doing a whole bunch of work. How do you just convey it in just a few key points? This is a definite challenge that we all face. And my suggestions are, first of all, seek feedback from your mentors, teachers, colleagues, and peers. Talking it over with others is a great way to help you really start to understand what those most important points are. Your mentors might be able to help ask you questions to think about really what the most important aspects of your project are. And for example, try telling someone what you learned from your project in just 1 sentence. It's a real challenge to keep a nice focused message in just 1 sentence, and it really forces you to think about what the most important points of your project are, and then that's how you can choose those main points for your presentation. And one last common challenge relates to technology. Technical difficulties abound as we give presentations on computers and over the internet. And for me in particular, I use a Mac and oftentimes present at conferences on a Windows-based machine, so computer platform incompatibilities is often a problem. My response and suggestion to this is it's really important to practice your slides on the computer that you're going to be using for the presentation beforehand if possible. Most conferences that I attend have a computer room where I can upload my presentation and see how it's going to look on the actual presentation computer. This is also really important if you have videos embedded in your presentation. Oftentimes I've seen people giving talks and they go to the slide with their video and it doesn't work and they're quite surprised. Video files have to be copied onto the presentation computer along with your PowerPoint file. And if you go through and are testing your slides on the presentation computer beforehand, you would actually figure this out and either try to fix it or come up with a plan B so you're not caught by surprise while giving your presentation. Some other things to look for when you're testing your slides are to make sure that your font and all the formatting on the slide didn't get messed up when it switched from PowerPoint for Mac to Windows or vice versa. So in summary, make sure you consider your time, your audience, and your message. And one other general tip is if you start early and you practice and get feedback from your colleagues and peers, that will help improve any presentation. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about some upcoming things for the Student Climate Research Campaign. We have some upcoming intensive observing periods, or IOPs. The upcoming ones this month of April are the Climate and Land Cover Project, as well as the Phenology and Climate Project is still going on. It's now springtime here in Colorado, and we're going out to our phenology site every day or every other day to look to see if budburst has happened yet. It hasn't quite happened, but hopefully it'll happen maybe in the next week or so. Also, we have more SCRC webinars coming up. The next one will be on April 23rd, Globe Data in Action, Examples from Latin America, Caribbean. We also have a quarterly update in May, and 2 more Globe Data in Action webinars in June from Near East North Africa region and from the North America region. Some upcoming events is that Globe will be at the National Science Teachers Association National Conference in San Antonio, Texas next week. It's 11 through 14 April. There will be a Globe booth at the exhibit hall, as well as Globe will be putting on talks and activities at the conference. So if you're going to be in attendance, please make sure to look for all the Globe activities. And then the Globe Annual Partner Meeting has been scheduled for 12 through 16 August at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center in Maryland. Some other SCRC activities. The entries for the Globe Virtual Student Conference are currently being accepted through April 15th, so you have just under 2 more weeks to submit those student projects to the Globe Virtual Student Conference. I'll talk a little bit more about some of those details on the next slide. Also, 16 through 22 April is when we'll be highlighting all the Earth Day video competition winners. The 1st through 31st of May is when the Student Research Exhibition nominations are going to open up. And for more information on the Student Research Exhibition, there is a related web link in the lower right part of your screen. On the 10th of August is when the Virtual Student Conference winners will be announced, and then a reminder that the 12th through 16th of August is the Globe Annual Meeting, and that's when the Student Research Exhibition will take place. So a few more details about the Globe Virtual Student Conference, since we're currently accepting entries for it right now, and given that this talk was about presenting your research results, this Virtual Student Conference is a great way for Globe students to do just that, present their research results to the Globe community. So for this conference, each student project should include an abstract, a research report, a video, which we talked a little bit about earlier, their contact information, and a photo release for all people appearing in the video. If the material is not in English, a translation of all material should also be provided. There is not any limit to the number of entries per school, so please get involved and get all of your students' research projects documented and entered into the Virtual Student Conference. Please send your entries to climatecampaign@globe.gov by April 15th. Once those projects have been received, they will be scored based on modified Intel Science Fair criteria, including creative ability, use of Globe data. This is one of the modifications, but it's really important to showcase how you've used Globe data, the scientific thought, thoroughness, knowledge achieved, and clarity. And the scores will be assigned by Globe scientists. And then during the conference, which takes place the 6th through 31st of May, students and all Globe community members are asked to go online to the Globe website and view the reports and videos and ask questions and make comments. Also during this time, the students who entered the research project should check their entry and answer any questions that have been asked of them. All right, I'd like to thank you all for attending. One more reminder about our next webinar on April 23rd. And do check out some of the web links below. I forgot to mention that I did include a web link called 10 Secrets to Giving a Good Scientific Talk. Here at the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research, they created a list of some tips, and so some of what I presented reflects their tips, but there's a lot more information at that website if you want to go check that out, as well as there's links to the Globe Scientist blog, the Virtual Student Conference page, and the Globe Facebook page, and so forth. So if you have any questions or comments, please enter them in the chat window, or if you think of some after this webinar is over, please let us know on the SCRC discussion forum. Thank you very much. Okay, I see a question from Jan. Should you encourage or discourage questions during your presentation? It would seem you risk running out of time if you do allow questions during your presentation, but at the same time you want your presentation to be interactive. Jan, this is a great question, and in my opinion, I think that this is up to the presenter, because in addition to the possibility that it will interfere with your timing, it can also interfere with the message and the flow that you've practiced. So depending on your speaking abilities, if you feel comfortable having those interruptions during your presentation, then you can allow questions during your presentation. Sometimes for really short presentations at conferences, though, it is really best to keep questions until the end. The reason why a lot of scientific conferences limit talks to 12 minutes is so that you talk for 12 and then have a couple minutes of questions before the next presentation starts, and so each presentation is technically a total of 15 minutes to include time for questions. During longer seminars, if you're giving like an hour-long presentation, sometimes it's best to allow questions during the presentation, because if you wait until the very end, people might have forgot the question, or you've talked about so many different things that it'll be hard to remember what the question was about. One more thing that I will mention about longer presentations, like an hour-long seminar, is that that doesn't necessarily mean that you can talk about more than just 1 to 3 key points. It really means that you can maybe give more detail on each of those points. But if you start talking about 5 to 10 things, again, your audience is only going to be able to go home and remember 1 to 3 of those things. So it's really important that you still remember to keep some of those key points focused. Are there any other questions or comments? Thank you, Nora. Marta, yes, yep, in Argentina you guys are in autumn, so your phenology and climate project would be starting to look for green down. I mentioned that we're looking for budburst here in the northern hemisphere, but southern hemisphere we would be encouraging the phenology and climate project participants to start looking at green down measurements. Okay, if there are no other questions or comments right now, please don't worry. Again, you can always ask questions and make comments on the webinars in the SCRC discussion forum, and we really encourage you to do so. We'll be posting a recording of this webinar on the Globe website later today as well, so you can share it with your colleagues if they weren't able to attend live. And thank you all again for attending and for the great questions. Good luck presenting your research.